Hey everyone, this is Scontras, and these are some tips for delivering a successful slides presentation. So my plan is to encourage you guys to think about what goes into your slides and to get you in the mindset of making choices as you put those slides together. And hopefully I will convince you that these choices, in fact, are quite important and make for a very effective presentation. Now, first, some preliminaries. If you're going to be giving a presentation and you have the ability, try to get to the room that you're going to be presenting in early. And early can mean days early or at least say 10 minutes before the presentation is going to begin. What this is going to do is allow you to familiarize yourself with the room so that when you're giving the presentation and dealing with the stress of standing in front of a room full of people, you will have eliminated at least one cause of stress, namely being in a strange place. Now, the other benefit of getting to the room early is that you can adjust as needed. So the room might not be set up the way you want it in terms of seating, so you can arrange those things. You can also test the technology, because chances are, if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. So you want to build in plenty of time so that you can fix any problems before they arise. Now, with those considerations in mind, the next thing that you want to think about as you're going to be putting together your slides is what in fact slides are, what they're doing for you. And I'd like to convince you that slides are a visual aid for you as you present. Now, there are various different ways that we interact with slides. So, in the top left here, you have someone who's working on the slides in a room in front of people as he goes. In the top right, this is how I like to interact with slides. I can't do it now because I'm on the internet, but you're standing with the slides, you're pointing things out physically, and it's a very dynamic presentation. In the bottom left, you have a teacher who is having a conversation with her students, and the slides are just there in the background, say, for reference. And finally, you have the sort of pinnacle of slide-based presentation, the Apple keynote, where you are just this little thing in front of these massive slides where all the content is being delivered. Now, whichever way you choose to interact with and use your slides, that's fine, but choose it. Decide what you want to do, and decide it on the basis of what you want to do with those slides. Now, next we want to consider what it means for these slides to be a visual aid, and what they're going to do for us. So I'd like to suggest that what slides do is allow you to emphasize points that you're making in your presentation. They help you structure your content for your audience and allow you to add detail that you can't add just by yourself with your voice. Now, keep in mind here that you, the presenter, you are the presentation, and you're using those slides as an aid. The slides are not the presentation on their own. So this brings me to, I think, an important difference between slides and, say, handouts or textbooks or web pages or what have you. They're not the same. They serve different purposes. So in slides, at least my preference is to have very short blurbs, very selected, curated content, and to use those slides as a presentation aid. Now, this contrasts with something like a handout where you deliver all of the content in full sentences so that the person who has that handout can then refer back to it later and learn from it. Now, what this means is you're going to have to put a lot of work into preparing your presentation in and above what you put into those slides, because the slides, again, are just going to contain the bare bones of what people need to be focusing on in the presentation, but you are going to be delivering the content. So you should practice exactly what it is that you intend to say, because it won't have been said there on the slide for you. Now, how to put together these slides. Well, this brings us to the topic of slide design. And I want to convince you that design is very, very important. So for that, here is a cautionary tale. Here's an image from the 2017 Oscars. We've got Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway reading the award for the Best Picture. Now Warren stands up there, looks at the card, a little confused. Faye finally takes it out of his hand and says La La Land. Now here is presumably what they were looking at. And what you notice here is the Oscars in big font at the top, even though they already know they're at the Oscars, they're standing there in front of everybody. And then we have Emma Stone and La La Land equally salient in terms of their typography in the center of that slide. So both of those things are important. And then at the very bottom, in tiny little font, we have the category that they're reading, Best Actress. And then we get the mistake. Faye Dunaway looks at this quickly, sees La La Land, reads La La Land, and the rest is history. But imagine if instead the card had looked something like this. So if you glance at this quickly, and you know that you're supposed to be reading the Best Picture award, all of a sudden you realize something is wrong. So compare these two side by side. On the top, it's clear from the typography alone that Emma Stone is the winner of the Best Actress award, and she was in this movie La La Land. In the bottom card, if I'm just looking at this quickly, now all of a sudden we can understand this mistake that was read, because La La Land looks pretty important. So this is all to say that as you're designing your slides, you should really play with the typography, because different typography can do different things for you. It allows you to accentuate things on the slide in and above just the words that you're choosing to include. Now, in addition to typography, I really like playing with the transitions. Now, these are the dynamic moves between slides. And in the example that I give in a little bit, I'll try to highlight how it is that you can use transitions to really focus people's attention in on exactly what it is that you want them to be attending to in your presentation. But when it comes to just general heuristics for designing your slides, here are a few. Choose a color, choose a font, choose a layout scheme, and most importantly, be consistent with your choices. You'll notice that here is a slide where I have various fonts and various colors, various layouts. And I have this here on purpose to demonstrate to you what a mess it is. It's really hard if you are in the audience and you're trying to get the content from this slide and you're distracted by all of these various design choices. So this brings me to the principles that Edward Tufte, a very famous graphic designer who's focused on visual displays of quantitative data, here are some principles that he laid out for us in terms of design. First, design should be invisible. Second, content counts most of all. And third, maximize content reasoning time to minimize format figuring out time. So what this all means is the central goal of whatever it is that you're doing in your slide design should be the content that you're trying to deliver. Now, I am encouraging you to design your slides to deliver that content, but the design is not the content. The content is. So to the extent that you've been successful in your design, it should be invisible, so that all people see are the content, which allows them to reason about that content and not be distracted by things like design. And as a general heuristic for how you might know whether or not you've maximized content reasoning time to minimize format figuring out time, I like to give the following example. Design like Google. Google is a search engine, and when you go to Google's homepage, you see one thing. You see a search bar. You type something into it, you search. So Google has maximized the content of search on its homepage It has all of its various other services there that you can get to if that's what you want, but the primary goal of Google is this search. So design like Google. As a contrast, I'd like to encourage you to not design like Yahoo. So this is a hot mess. Here's a search page with all of this content on it. So how could you possibly know what to focus on? In addition to that, the various design choices that have been made aren't consistent across aspects of this page. So, as you're putting your slides together, really try to pare things down to the essentials. Be conscious in your design choices so that what really comes across is the content. Now, what I'd like to do is walk you through an example presentation that I recently gave. So this is a short 5-minute presentation. I'll walk you through the whole thing. I'm not going to focus so much on the actual content as much as I'll be focusing on the choices that I made to put that content on these slides. All right, so here we go. So the first thing that you need for your slides presentation is some sort of title slide. I happen to prefer my title slides quite simple, but this is because I know that my slide presentation is going to get a lot more elaborate as I go. So for me, this is sort of a fun joke that I'm in on, that the audience might not be, that things look really simple to start. You'll also notice that I've used a black background here. I really like black backgrounds because it allows me, when I'm interacting with these slides physically, to not get blinded by the projector light. And these black backgrounds are also very effective when it comes to low contrast projectors. So it's easier to see these slides, to read the content. The other thing you'll notice is that I'm using a sans serif font, something like Helvetica or Arial. These sorts of fonts are much easier to read from afar, like on slides. Now this contrasts with if you're reading something close up, like in a book, then the serif fonts are much easier to read. So just keep that in mind as you're choosing things like fonts in your slide. All right, so from the title slide, I go immediately into the puzzle that we're going to be confronting, right? So I show people a visual image to whet their intuitions and say, okay, imagine that you want to name something in this scene. Now, I include a little joke and say, what you're going to be looking at is a small brown cardboard box. Right? And then I contrast this in a different font type, different color, different spot on the screen with the deviant way of naming that object, namely the cardboard brown small box. And all of a sudden, people have an intuition for what it is we're talking about, namely adjective ordering preferences. This contrast, these are adjective ordering preferences, right? So I want to abstract away from the specifics of this scene while keeping the relevant content. So I'm going to keep the small brown cardboard box and tell people that these are adjective ordering preferences in English. So here is a slide that I'm going to build up with a whole lot of content stepwise. And what I want is this content to in fact overwhelm people with the significance of this phenomenon. So I say these are the preferences in English. Oh, and by the way, here are a host of other languages like English where you find the exact same preferences. Great. Now again, I want to build up more and more content on this slide, so I'm going to keep this information here, but move it off to the left, label it as those prenominal languages where adjectives precede nouns, bold the noun so it anchors this example, and then reverse it on the right side with the postnominal languages where adjectives follow nouns, where again you find the same preferences. Okay, so here is the striking pattern, and then you have the big why question. In my case, why should we be finding these preferences everywhere we look for them? Now this why question is how we're starting off the presentation. I started with a very simple, concrete example of the puzzle. I elaborated on that puzzle by making it more interesting with all of these other languages. And then we get to why should we care? Why are we finding these preferences everywhere? You want to make sure that if you're giving a research presentation, you motivate that research with a puzzle, and then you tell people why they should care. Now, given that I'm asking a why presentation and doing some science, I probably want to give people a hint of the sorts of hypotheses that we might be considering as answers to this why question. So I'm going to keep why on the screen and get rid of the other details and move it to the center. And here is one hypothesis, namely that these preferences are hard-coded into the syntax via something like universal grammar. And I've used an image here to visualize what this hypothesis might mean. This image is also going to serve me later so that I can just use that image to remind people of this specific version of the hypothesis. Now I'm going to contrast this hypothesis with a different hypothesis, so I want to keep this on the screen, move it to the left, and introduce the other hypothesis, namely that these principles are emerging from general properties of cognition. Again, I've used an image here that can anchor this idea. People are much better at remembering images than they are at remembering text. So whenever you have a very important concept that you're presenting to them, make sure that you anchor it with an image so they can tag that information with that image. Now, because I'm using black backgrounds, it's harder to get images that themselves have black backgrounds. So you'll notice that this brain here has a strange little white outline to it. And what I did is sort of reformat that picture so that it now has a white glow to not make that white halo so distracting. Okay, so now I have my two hypotheses, and I'm going to focus on this cognitive one, and so I want to elaborate on it and give you, in fact, a very specific version of that hypothesis, namely that the subjectivity of the adjectives is going to decrease as you get closer to that noun. I've put that arrow there, labeled it with subjectivity decreases to maximize people's ability to whet their intuitions about what this hypothesis entails. And then I'm going to give them an example of that hypothesis in action. So I bring in this box that we can talk about. I bring it from the left and move it into the right because it follows the arrow. And then I say, okay, the thing is cardboard, yes, yes, yes. Probably brown, yep. Is it small? Well, here we might disagree. And this illustrates to people what it means for the subjectivity to decrease the closer you get to the noun. Okay. Now at this point, it's a 5-minute presentation, so I have to dive right into how I'm going to test this hypothesis. And I want some structure to this presentation, so here you might consider adding an outline slide of what you are going to do to test the hypothesis. I actually prefer not doing that and letting the individual parts of the presentation stand on their own. So here, I give you that structure by labeling this as step 1. So you'll know that there are more steps coming. So in this step, we're measuring what those ordering preferences actually are. And rather than trying to describe to people the task that participants performed, I actually show it to them. So that there is no guessing, here is exactly what people did, and it saves me the trouble of doing all of these verbal acrobatics trying to explain precisely what happened. Now at the bottom I give a little bit more information about the task, telling the audience that there were 26 different adjectives from 7 semantic classes. So now they know exactly how we collected that data, and this is how we were measuring the ordering preferences. Then I move on to the second step, where we validated these preferences with corpora. Now this is a pretty text-heavy slide because it was a rather complex task that we performed, going into corpora and extracting all of these multi-adjective strings and calculating the average distance of each adjective from the noun. So I know this going into the presentation that this is going to be a difficult slide to explain. So this is a slide that I had to practice a lot to make sure I knew exactly what I was going to say. Now, I have the data from the corpus. I told you how I got the behavioral data. So the next thing I'm going to do is compare that data with each other, with itself. Who knows how to say that? So I've put a plot on the slide. And the first thing that you, the presenter, want to do is orient your audience by saying, okay, on the y-axis, I'm plotting that corpus metric that I just told you how we measured. And on the x-axis, I'm plotting the behavioral metric that I just told you how we measured. Okay? Each of those dots represents an adjective, and here you're seeing a beautiful correlation. And to reinforce that correlation, I tell you at the bottom, these ordering preferences are tracking the corpus measure, suggesting that the behavioral data that we're getting is, in fact, picking up on the ordering preferences. Now, on this slide, I spent a little bit of time trying to orient the audience on how it is that they should be interpreting this plot, because I know that a lot more of these plots are going to be coming. So if I do the work up front, I'll be saving myself some time later. Okay, so then we move on to the third step, namely measuring the adjective subjectivity. Again, I show them exactly what the task is. Here I don't have to repeat that there were 26 different adjectives because we've been talking about those same 26 adjectives this whole time. So that would just be redundant information. Okay, so now I have the pieces that I need to test my hypothesis. So I remind people of exactly what that hypothesis is, and then I show them the test of it. So on the y-axis, again, orient the audience, I'm plotting the preferred distance measure, the ordering preferences. So as values increase, an adjective is preferred farther away from the noun. And on the x-axis, orient the audience, I'm plotting those subjectivity scores. So as values increase, subjectivity increases. And then I give the audience concrete examples. So on the top there, we have the adjective small, which is from the example that I started with, small brown cardboard box. So there's small, it has high subjectivity and it's preferred farther from the noun. Then we have brown. It has low subjectivity, it's preferred closer to the noun. So subjectivity is increasing with the preferred distance from the noun, just as we suspected. Now in this next slide here, what I'm doing is hitting people over the head with the fact that this finding replicates. Okay? It's a 5-minute presentation. I can't walk them through the dozens of experiments that went into all of these plots. But what I can do is give them a sense that we've done due diligence in testing this hypothesis, and that this hypothesis in fact holds. Okay? Now these are all with the same 26 adjectives, so finally I can say, aha, you might think it doesn't generalize, but in fact we went into the switchboard corpus, and with all of these multi-adjective strings, subjectivity still predicts adjective ordering preferences. And you'll notice that I didn't have to orient people with each of these slides now because I've done the work of doing it before. So they're familiar with looking at these plots and they know what it means for the hypothesis to be successful, namely what a strong correlation would look like in these plots. Okay? So they've seen all of this data, and then what I do is actually give them an interpretation of these results on its own slide that's very simple, namely that subjectivity indeed predicts adjective ordering preferences. I think slides like these, you might think they're throwaway, but they're in fact very, very useful because this is the takeaway. Like if you remember nothing else from this presentation, remember this. This is the conclusion. It also happens to be the title of the talk. Okay, so then there's this big conclusion, but I want to elaborate it on it a little bit. So this is going to be moving into something like a general discussion. Of course, it's a short talk, so I have to do this very quickly. So I tell people what we know about subjectivity with an image that they can latch onto. So namely, less subjective content is more useful for accurately communicating about the world. So if you hear small, the top bubble on the left, you imagine a broader range of things, the top bubble on the right, than if you hear brown. And what people seem to be doing is consolidating this less subjective content around the noun. So I've given people a way of understanding why we should have found this finding in the first place. Here's some way of interpreting it. And now at this point, I need to wrap up the presentation by folding it back in on itself. So here's what I mean. I go back to the hypothesis slide. I tell them that we seem to have evidence for the adjective ordering preferences emerging from these general cognitive principles. And then I go back to the puzzle and I say, well, now we have a way of understanding why it is that we prefer to say the small brown cardboard box as opposed to the cardboard brown small box. And I introduce a little joke and say, even though I know you all want to talk about the cat. From this immediately go right into a thank you slide. These are crucial. So on the thank you slide, if you have any funding agencies, you need to acknowledge those. You can have some images for your home institution. This is a slide that you want to be comfortable having up for a long time, because if you have a question period after your talk, this is probably what's going to be up there for the duration of that question period, unless you need to move back to slides that you presented. Now for this presentation, I was giving a short version of a longer presentation that was going to happen the next day. So I kept this thanks on there, and I added a little advertisement for the full version of the talk. Okay, so here is an example of a presentation and the design choices that I made in putting this presentation together. I hope it proves useful to you as you make presentations on your own. And thank you.